It was just after sunset on a crisp autumn evening in the small town of Willow Creek, Colorado, an hour when most of its 8,000 residents were settling in for dinner, flipping through the day's mail, or catching the nightly news. But for 78-year-old Eleanor Ellie Patterson, this hour had become a ritual of unease. Propelling herself along the familiar sidewalk that curved past oak trees shedding golden leaves, she could feel the slight but unmistakable shift in the air. Tension, like static before a storm. Tonight felt different, colder somehow, despite the season. Ellie had made this route past the cafe that sold her favorite blueberry scones, along the brick wall of the community center, and finally home to her tidy bungalow on Elm Street. Thousands of times. A retired civil rights lawyer, she was as much a fixture of Willow Creek as the old clock tower that chimed each quarter hour. Neighbors waved when they passed. The Jenkins family walking their golden retriever. Mr. Ruiz watering his begonias. Chang, who always stopped to ask about Ellie's arthritis. But tonight, she noticed no waving, no greetings, just empty windows and locked doors. Clutching her navy blue tote, inside it, her reading glasses and the latest John Grisham novel, Ellie slowed down when she spotted the cruiser. Parked just past the corner where Elm met Maple, its headlights off, engine idling softly, it seemed out of place. The corner shop had been closed for renovations for months. There was no reason for a patrol car to be stationed there. She swallowed a nervous breath but refused to let it show. Keep moving, she told herself. Don't look back. But as she pivoted her wheelchair for the last few feet home, the cruiser's engine clicked into gear. The taillights glowed red, then switched on their low beams, washing the sidewalk in a dull flush. Heart hammering, Ellie inched forward. Then she heard the crisp sound of a car door opening. "Good evening, ma'am," came the drawled voice of a man in his late 40s. He stepped into the street, hands resting casually on his belt. His uniform was crisp, the badge on his chest shone under the street lamp. He was broad-shouldered and carried himself with the ease of someone accustomed to unquestioned authority. Ellie recognized him. Officer Mark Simmons. Though she'd never had reason to speak with him directly before. "Everything all right?" she asked politely, flattening the folds of her wool shawl across her lap. He clicked his tongue. "Just making sure. It's late to be out alone, especially in an area where we've had a few break-ins lately." Ellie's spine straightened. She'd fought for decades against exactly this kind of condescension. "Officer, I've lived on Elm Street since 1965. I know these sidewalks better than anyone. I'm heading home from the library, no more, no less." He narrowed his eyes but didn't smile. "I'm just concerned about your safety," he said, stepping closer. The warmth of his patrol car headlights reached Ellie's face, and she flinched as a chill moved down her neck. "Thank you," she said firmly. "Drive safe." He lingered, watching her roll forward, until she was a few feet away. Then he turned back to his cruiser without another word. Ellie let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The final rays of sunset had vanished. The street felt suddenly darker. She rounded the last corner, reached her driveway, and fumbled for her key. Inside her cozy living room, she locked the door and leaned against it, closing her eyes. It shouldn't have rattled her so much. She'd faced down hostile judges, snarling police in riot gear, and real danger on the picket lines. But the raw audacity of a uniformed officer calling her unsafe on her own street stirred something in her bones. This wasn't protection. It was intimidation. The next morning's sunshine felt harsh as it streamed through the lace curtains. Over a cup of chamomile tea, Ellie replayed the confrontation. Simmons' smirk as he spoke, his eyes lingering too long on her silver hair and the tray of books in her lap. She could almost hear his voice. "Just making sure you're okay." It was a phrase she'd heard 100 times in courtrooms, always right before her opponents slammed the gavel down. Determination replaced her unease. She might be old, she might use a wheelchair, but she was nobody's charity case. She opened her laptop, logged into the town's community forum, and typed a simple post. Last night I was stopped and questioned by Officer Mark Simmons on Elm Street in broad daylight while returning from the library. Has anyone else experienced this? Is this safety protocol or simple harassment? She hit post and leaned back, heart fluttering. Within minutes, replies appeared. One neighbor had seen Simmons parked near the community center for weeks. Another friend described a similar stop near the high school. A retired school teacher recalled Simmons demanding to see her ID while she walked her dog. The posts built into a small chorus of concern until a private message popped up. Eleanor, it's Jenna Parker from the library. I saw it happen. Simmons got out, advanced on you like you were a suspect. I recorded it on my phone. I'll share when we meet. Jenna. Ellie's pulse raced. A video? This was more than hearsay. She shot back, please. I'll come by this afternoon, thank you. By midday, while the town buzzed with talk of senior safety checks, Ellie wheeled herself to the library. Jenna waited behind the circulation desk, her brow furrowed, phone in hand. He swore I was acting suspiciously, Ellie said as they moved to a study room. Jenna opened her phone. A shaky, grainy clip showing Simmons emerge from the cruiser, blocking Ellie's path, reaching toward the back of her wheelchair. As Simmons leaned in, Ellie spat out her ID. Eleanor Patterson, born and raised on Elm Street. I'm heading home. He stared, then backed off, his ego wounded, not his victim. Ellie watched the clip twice. Her chest tightened. This was undeniable, a pattern of harassment, targeting vulnerable residents. Simmons' sunglasses obscured his face, but his uniform and badge number were clear. This is it, Ellie said, fighting tears. This is exactly why I fought for so long. Jenna nodded. People need to see this. Later that afternoon, Ellie crafted a formal complaint to the town's police oversight board, attaching the video and her eyewitness statement. She copied it to the county sheriff and the state's civil rights division. Then she wrote to her granddaughter, federal judge Mariah Delgado in Denver, "Need your counsel, please." Mariah's reply was swift. "I'm on the next train. Don't do anything until I get there." By evening, Ellie sat in her living room surrounded by decades of civil rights memorabilia, framed photos with Thurgood Marshall, awards for her landmark cases, and a stack of unopened mail. Outside, the streetlights glowed softly, but the air was anything but soft. A storm was coming, and Eleanor Patterson was ready to meet it head-on. When Judge Mariah Delgado stepped into her grandmother's Elm Street living room late that afternoon, the air felt thick with restless energy. Ellie Patterson, her silver hair tucked neatly under a knit cap, sat perched on the edge of her armchair, laptop open on her lap, scrolling through a cascade of neighbors' comments. It was as if the entire town of Willow Creek had suddenly woken up to something they'd always known but never admitted. Officer Simmons had been patrolling their streets, not out of duty, but out of suspicion toward anyone who didn't fit his narrow vision of respectability. Mariah, a federal district judge in Denver now, back in the small Colorado town of her youth, let the door click softly behind her and then smiled, a mix of relief and steely determination. "Grandma," she said, setting down her clipboard and shoulder bag, "I read your post. This is bigger than I thought." Ellie looked up, her brown eyes reflecting both pride and exhaustion. "It's not just about me, Mariah. It's about anyone who's ever felt uneasy under the gaze of a badge. Look at this. Mrs. Harper, the retired teacher on Willow Lane, stopped for loitering outside her own home. Mr. Kim, our pastor, questioned for unusual behavior at the park." She flicked her finger down the screen. "You see, it's the same script, different actors. Simmons thinks he can stop any of us just because we're older or different shades of brown." Mariah knelt beside her grandmother, examining the comments. Each new name, each fresh memory of harassment stitched together a pattern that was impossible to ignore. "We need evidence," she said, "not just stories, but proof. Your video, Jenna's clip, that's our foundation. We'll file a formal complaint tomorrow with the state civil rights division, and I've already drafted a letter to the U.S. Attorney's Office requesting a federal civil rights inquiry." Ellie closed the laptop with a soft snap. Good. Let them know I'm ready to testify. She leaned forward. But first, we need more footage. Jenna's tape was perfect. We need to scare him into flipping up that collar and giving us his best angle. Mariah raised an eyebrow. We're not scaring anyone. We're documenting misconduct. If Simmons has nothing to hide, he'll welcome the scrutiny. Ellie laughed, a short, textured sound. You haven't lived here for years. He'll resist on principle. She stood, adjusting her shawl. I'm going to Miss Johnson's. She has security cameras trained on her garage. She said Simmons has parked too close a dozen times. I want that footage. Mariah rose, smoothing her blazer. I'll ride with you. And I want to stop by the sheriff's office, hand-deliver the complaint. It'll show them we mean business. No email, no waiting on bureaucratic slow-rolling. 20 minutes later, they navigated Ellie's wheelchair through the crisp autumn dusk, the leaves crunching beneath their wheels. At Miss Johnson's bright porch light, a silver-haired woman in gardening gloves met them. Her security camera perched by the garage door like a friendly sentinel. You got it? Ellie asked. That's right, Miss Johnson said, guiding them into her foyer. I downloaded last night's footage. Watch how that cruiser creeps up. No lights, no reason. In Miss Johnson's living room, Mariah connected a USB drive to the TV. The grainy video showed Simmons' cruiser back up close enough to make Miss Johnson's dog bark, then cut its engine and stay there for nearly 5 minutes before finally pulling away. Ellie's jaw clenched. This is exactly what I feared. Maria pressed pause. We have it. Let's get back to Grandma's. There's someone else you should talk to. Outside, the wind began to rattle window panes like distant applause. Back at Ellie's cottage, they found Jenna Parker waiting by the kitchen table, sipping chamomile tea. Ellie set down her laptop. Here's the next piece of the puzzle, she announced, handing over the drive. Jenna's thin fingers trembled as she loaded the video. In the small frame, Simmons leaned against his cruiser, his gaze sweeping the empty street. When Ellie rolled by in her wheelchair, he stepped forward, calling out, Miss Patterson, you got something to hide? His badge glinted, his tone a blend of challenge and smug delight. Jenna handed the remote to Mariah. I got anxious zooming in, but you can see his badge number, 2594, and his partner, Officer Lopez, badge 3141. Walks around to watch, too. Mariah nodded. Perfect. We'll include both in the complaint. Now, I want sworn statements from all three of you. Grandma, you were the victim. Jenna, you captured it, and Miss Johnson has the garage footage. Then we'll add a written statement from your neighbor, Mr. Clark, who's seen Simmons tail him on evening walks. Ellie lay down on her couch, exhaustion finally catching up. They'll stonewall us, she muttered. Mariah sat beside her and took her hand. Let them try. We've got the law, and we've got the town. I've already spoken to County Commissioner Alvarez. He's on our side, pushing for an official town council hearing. You won't be alone, Grandma. Ellie managed a small smile. Town hall is where I cut my teeth. Back in the day, they thought I'd get laughed off the dais. Now, ready to laugh back. Over the next 24 hours, the trio worked in swift rhythm, crafting formal affidavits, uploading footage to a secure legal portal, and delivering the multi-page complaint in person to the state civil rights office in the county seat. Mariah's presence as a federal judge made the clerks pause. They stamped the documents with unusual haste. On a crisp morning, Ellie rolled into the county courthouse lobby, escorted by Mariah and Jenna. The walls echoed with footsteps and hushed conversations. They climbed the marble stairs to the open-door conference room, where a panel of Civil Rights Division investigators waited, faces attentive but neutral. Ellie introduced herself, her voice steady. She laid out the incidents, her own, Miss Johnson's, Mr. Clark's, Jenna's footage, each detail sharpening the picture of a police officer abusing authority. She spoke not with trembling passion, but with the calm precision of a lawyer accustomed to the gravest stakes. By the time she finished, heads nodded around the table. One investigator leaned forward. Officer Simmons and Officer Lopez will be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. We'll coordinate with the Sheriff's Office and potentially the U.S. Attorney's Office on civil rights charges if warranted." Ellie's breath caught. "Thank you," she said softly. Outside, fresh snowflakes drifted in the sidewalk's gloom, dusting the town like petals from an unseen blossom. Mariah hugged her grandmother tight. "You did it," she whispered. Ellie patted her granddaughter's back, a sparkle lighting her eyes. "We did it. Now the whole town will have to see me, and everyone else, standing tall." As they descended the courthouse steps together, cameras from a local news crew captured their calm exit. Ellie paused to face them, holding her chin high. Mariah and Jenna flanked her, a united front of 3 generations of justice. The flash of the cameraman's bulb was more than a moment of fame. It was the first light of a reckoning long overdue in Willow Creek, Colorado. By the next morning, Willow Creek seemed suspended in a hush that felt both hopeful and fraught, as if the entire town were holding its breath, waiting to see whether Officer Simmons' behavior would finally be met with real consequences. Judge Mariah Delgado woke before dawn, long after she'd set her grandmother's nightlight in the living room to guide late calls from the state civil rights investigator. She dressed quickly, mindful of the weight she carried as a federal judge walking into the sheriff's office. Her old high school's rival homecoming turned harbor of intimidation. She wanted every step to ring clear. She belonged here, and she would not be silenced. Ellie Patterson was already at her kitchen window when Mariah slipped downstairs, oversized cardigan wrapped around her shoulders. Behind her, the lace curtains trembled in the autumn breeze, as though the house itself were too eager for justice. Ellie's hands gripped the windowsill, her knuckles pale. "You sure about this?" she called softly, not as a question but as a shared acknowledgement of the moment's gravity. Mariah stepped into view, her tailored navy trench coat and the quiet authority in her stride a stark counterpoint to the sleeping town. "I've never been more certain," she said, and they slipped out together into the dawn. They arrived at the sheriff's department just as the sun painted the horizon rose and gold. The building, an aging red brick structure with a peeling white sign, felt smaller somehow, its corners softened by yesterday's leaf litter. Ellie paused at the front door, took a breath, and pushed through. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed over rows of gray desks and off-duty deputies sipping stale coffee. Mariah led the way, Ellie in her wheelchair a respectful half-step behind, and Jenna Parker trailing, with a legal pad and a tremor of righteous indignation on her lips. Sheriff Tom Gonzalez, formerly the affable face at every county fair, now looking decidedly less relaxed, stood in the lobby, arms folded. His uniform had never fit him quite right, but today it looked pinched, like the department itself was pulling at the seams beneath mounting scrutiny. "Judge Delgado," he said, offering a stiff nod that did not reach his eyes. "What can I do for you?" Mariah laid a thick folder of exhibits, security camera stills, video clips from Ms. Johnson's porch, Jenna's smartphone footage, sworn statements, on the front desk. "I'm here formally to request that Officers Simmons, Badge 2594, and Lopez, Badge 3141, be placed on administrative leave pending an impartial investigation into multiple allegations of civil rights violations. My grandmother and several other residents have faced unwarranted stops, intimidation, and in some cases physical handling while on public sidewalks in their own neighborhood." The sheriff's eyes flicked to Ellie. She returned his gaze calmly, the echo of the night Simmons yanked her wheelchair, reminding him silently of his department's failure. After a beat, Gonzalez cleared his throat. "These are serious accusations," he murmured. "I'll have to follow protocol, consult with the county attorney, conduct an internal affairs review." Mariah's jaw set. Internal Affairs has already collected the initial complaint. The state's Civil Rights Division is investigating, and I've notified the U.S. Attorney's Office. This isn't a social call, Sheriff. These men have shown they will not police themselves. She tapped the folder. "Would you prefer a subpoena?" Gonzalez paled, clearly unprepared for her firmness, but a flicker of something, Perhaps relief at no longer carrying sole responsibility crossed his face. "No," he replied, voice low. "We'll act immediately." As Mariah and Ellie turned to leave, Jenna slipped ahead and asked softly, "Sheriff, can I assume Officer Denton will cooperate with seizing his dashcam footage?" Their local rogue, Kyle Denton, having shown a similar pattern of overreach. Gonzalez's shoulders slumped. "He will. We're an accountable department." Out in the crisp morning air, the three of them exhaled, part relief, part steely readiness. No sooner had they mounted the curb than Mariah's phone buzzed. A text from State Investigator Ramirez confirming that warrants for Simmons's and Lopez's dashcams were signed, effective immediately. "That was fast," Jenna said in wonder. Ellie beamed, her earlier fatigue replaced by that familiar spark of triumph. "Justice can move swiftly when we refuse to look away," she said. Their victory, however, was just the beginning. Within hours, the local newspaper, once content to reprint Sheriff's Department press releases, ran its own front-page story. "Judicial intervention in Simmons case. Will Willow Creek's finest scrutiny?" Gossip like wildfire spread through the town's coffee shops and post office lines, each retelling adding new outrage. "I told you that cop was trouble." Finally, someone held his badge up to the light. That afternoon, Mariah and Ellie wheeled themselves into a community coalition meeting at the First Presbyterian Church, complete with mismatched folding chairs and homemade cookies Mrs. Lee insisted on serving. More than 50 residents showed up. Retired teachers, clergy, shop owners, college students. They listened as Mariah overviewed next steps, public records requests, timelines for the state inquiry, rights to legal representation, and as Ellie shared tips on how anybody could document interactions, always ask for a name, record audio when permissible, flag witnesses by name. Jenna distributed a simple trifold pamphlet, Your Civil Rights in Public Spaces, a quick guide. The room hummed with energy. People who'd whispered in hallways now raised their hands to speak, recounting tailgates at family barbecues where uniformed cars lurked too close, evening strolls interrupted by traffic stops for no reason. A high school senior described being stopped outside the library where he volunteered. "You're too young and nice for this," he'd told the officer. Each tiny injustice now gleamed as part of a mosaic demanding change. By sunset, the coalition had a name, Willow Creek Watch, and a website ready for reporting incidents. Mariah pledged pro bono legal oversight. Ellie promised monthly Know Your Rights cafes. Jenna volunteered to handle social media outreach. On the church's weathered wooden bulletin board, someone stuck up a poster. "Stand up, speak out, Willow Creek Watch kickoff meeting, next Tuesday, 7 p.m. As Mariah helped Ellie out into the cooling evening, they paused under the old oak in the parking lot, its branches like bony arms stretching overhead. "This is how we break the cycle," Mariah said. Ellie smiled, eyes soft but fierce. "We show them that power only lasts until people decide enough is enough." And in that quiet, powerful moment, 3 generations poised on the brink of something new. The wind sighed through the leaves, as if the town itself were exhaling its first true breath of freedom. By midweek, Willow Creek's usual hum of peaceful routines had been replaced by an undercurrent of anticipation. Something big was brewing and everyone could feel it. In the courthouse basement offices, State Investigator Ramirez leaned back in his swivel chair, scanning the dossier before him. Dashcam footage from Simmons and Lopez, sidewalk camera stills from Miss Johnson's porch, Jenna Parker's shaky but damning cell phone video, and half a dozen sworn statements from neighbors. Each exhibit built a case thicker than the town's maple leaf carpets in November. He tapped his pen, eyes narrowing. They caught him on 3 separate nights, backing up his cruiser, flicking off his lights, inching closer to seniors on their front porches. "That's not routine patrol," he called to his partner, Investigator Kim, who was cross-referencing the video's timestamps with police logs. "Kim, Simmons has no legitimate calls recorded on these patrols. His suspicious activity entries, code 1048, check welfare, are all fabrications." Kim frowned, scrolling. He's falsified reports, and Lopez signed off on every one. This looks like coordinated harassment." Ramirez stood, pacing. "Coordinate a raid on the station this afternoon. I want Simmons and Lopez interviewed at 2:00 on site. I want their partners in on it. Denton, Nolan, everyone. Let's see who squills first." Across town, Ellie Patterson was finishing her weekly Know Your Rights gathering in the church basement. About 20 residents lingered, trading coffee-stained envelopes, copies of the formal complaint, news clippings of Mariah's federal referral, and the new Willow Creek Watch pamphlets detailing how to file internal affairs complaints and request dashcam footage under open records laws. Ellie's voice carried as she stowed her grandmother's laptop. "Remember, folks, evidence is power. Keep documenting. If you see an officer behaving improperly, record it audio first, video second. Note badge numbers, partner names, times, and locations. We're building a real-time map of misconduct in Willow Creek." A retired mail carrier, Mr. Patel, raised a hand. "I saw Officer Simmons flag down Mrs. Garcia by the community center last Thursday, just because she was gathering signatures for a petition. I didn't get video, too fast, but I saw him give her a ticket for soliciting without permit." Heads nodded. Jenna Parker, perched on a folding chair, scribbled in her notepad. "Write it down, Mr. Patel. We'll include your statement in the investigation." Outside, the wind rattled the church windows, an early warning of the storm gathering in the sheriff's station. At exactly 1:45 p.m., Ramirez and Kim, flanked by uniformed deputies assigned as security details, swept into the station's internal affairs office. The cramped room smelled of stale coffee and nervous energy. Simmons, in plain clothes, sat at a metal table with cross-legged posture, a grim set to his jaw. Lopez stood behind him, shifting uncomfortably. Both men were cuffed, their badges and sidearms laid on a gurney, likely for impound. Ramirez set a pile of printouts and USB drives before them. "Officers Simmons and Lopez, you are here under suspicion of falsifying police records and violating civil rights. We have multiple video recordings showing you engaging in unauthorized surveillance and intimidation of residents, primarily those over 65 or belonging to minority communities. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you." Simmons's face hardened. "Officer Lopez was just following my lead," he spat. "I was checking on welfare. This isn't some big racial thing." Kim slid the dashcam clip onto the screen. The footage showed Simmons's cruiser inching out of shadow, headlights off, then coasting behind Ellie Patterson until he got within 6 feet of her wheelchair. "Is that how you check welfare?" Kim asked. Simmons's lips twisted. "I saw unusual movement. Couldn't take chances." Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "From your own notes, there were 0 calls in that area, so you created a phony welfare check. Again, falsified record." He turned to Lopez. "Officer Lopez, what's your role in this?" Lopez swallowed. I trust Senior Officer Simmons's judgment." Ramirez leaned forward. "Trust doesn't override the law. You're complicit." He glanced at the uniformed deputies. "I want complete personnel files for both of you, past complaints, commendations, training records. Schedule follow-up interviews with every partner you've been on ride-along with in the last 2 years." By 3:30 p.m., the entire investigative team had seized records, taken written statements, and impounded unmarked surveillance rigs Simmons kept in his trunk. The sheriff's station had never been quieter. Radios crackled unanswered, and deputies eyed one another like cattle awaiting slaughter. Meanwhile, word of the investigation splashed across local news sites. 2 Willow Creek officers under state investigation for civil right violations, read the banner on the Willow Creek Gazette's homepage. Social media lit up with commentary. "Finally, they had it coming, and I hope they lose their badges." The hashtag WillowWatch trended regionally as coalition members shared video links and updated residents on how to submit their own evidence. By late afternoon, Mariah Delgado returned from a meeting at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Denver, where she'd briefed the Civil Rights Division on the state investigation's progress. The federal team, armed with the same footage, had opened a parallel probe into the pattern and practice of using fabricated welfare checks to target vulnerable citizens. She and Ellie reunited at the Patterson cottage just as the sun dipped behind the Blue Ridge foothills, casting long, tinged gold shadows. Jenna was already live streaming from the front porch, narrating updates for the dozens watching online. Ellie sank into her armchair, weary but triumphant. Feels like we're finally breaking through the wall. Mariah poured tea. The state raid should give the sheriff no choice but to place Simmons and Lopez on leave. The U.S. Attorney's Office may step in for criminal charges, depending on what they find. Jenna flipped her phone around. The stream's blown up. 1,200 watching right now. They want to know what's next. Ellie tapped her teacup. Next. Truth. When the officers testify under oath, we'll expose the full scope of their misconduct. And when deputies like Nolan come forward, we'll show it wasn't just two bad apples, it was a culture. At 6:00 p.m., the sheriff live-streamed his press statement from the station's front steps, flanked by Gonzalez and the warden of internal affairs. In light of the state's investigation, officers Simmons and Lopez have been placed on administrative leave. We take these allegations seriously and will cooperate fully. His voice was flat, rehearsed. While the statement echoed around front stoops and living rooms, Willow Creek Watch volunteers posted screen grabs of the raid and restreamed the dashcam clips. A retired 6th Street resident, Ms. Anderson, uploaded a testimony of her own. Another evening harassment by Simmons last spring, dismissed at the time as a misunderstanding. By nightfall, the town's network of solidarity felt unstoppable. Everything from the local diner to the library's after-school reading club buzzed with conversation about citizen rights, law enforcement accountability, and the coalition's next town hall meeting to propose new oversight legislation. Upstairs in the Patterson cottage, Ellie and Mariah sat side by side, watching a live panel on the news. A civil rights attorney from Denver praised Willow Creek's grassroots activism, calling it a template for small-town justice nationwide. Below the screen, a graphic showed Willow Creek, a test case for community-driven reform. Ellie rubbed her temple. Who'd have thought a quiet old lady in a wheelchair could start a revolution? Mariah took her hand and smiled. You were never just a wheelchair, Grandma. You were the spark. Jenna joined them, wiping sweat from her brow. I'm exhausted. But tomorrow I'll be back live at the next coalition meeting. She grinned. We're going over procedural reforms, mandatory body cam review schedules, citizen review panels, and an anonymous reporting hotline. Ellie's eyes glistened. And then we'll hold our town council to a vote. We'll demand codified oversight, no more polite nods in meeting rooms. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the living room's shadows deepening as the lamps glowed warm. Outside, the faint echo of children's laughter drifted down the street, proof that life in Willow Creek had not stopped. It had only shifted course. Mariah sat back, a sense of calm resolve settling over her. It's only part of the story, she said. We still have to see Internal Affairs' full findings, the U.S. Attorney's decisions, and the Council's vote. But tomorrow, we push the town to enshrine these reforms in binding policy. Because real change requires more than headlines, it needs laws. Ellie nodded, her steel-spine smile returning. We've made Simmons and Lopez visible today. Now we make the system visible and accountable. And in that moment, 3 generations of unyielding courage bound by love and justice, Willow Creek took its next unwavering step toward true accountability, determined to see the reckoning through until every corner of its community could walk home unafraid. As spring unfurled its first green buds across Willow Creek, the tide of change that had begun on quiet suburban sidewalks had grown into a sweeping current, reshaping every corner of town in its wake. By the time May rolled around, standing in the softly lit meeting room of the Willow Creek Community Center, Mariah Delgado could feel the weight of history on her shoulders and in her heart, a fierce pride. Beside her sat Ellie Patterson, still in her trademark wheelchair though now draped in a smart navy blazer, and Jenna Parker, clutching a stack of reform proposals that had already begun to hum with community support. The audience, nearly 200 strong, filled folding chairs arranged in neat rows. There were retirees with silver hair brightening in the lamplight, parents clutching toddler hands, college students perched on the edges of their seats, and a handful of uniformed deputies who, only weeks before, would have seemed inconceivable in this setting. A quiet ripple of applause broke out as Mariah stepped to the lectern, the official proclamation of the Special Oversight Committee projected behind her. Willow Creek Community Oversight Committee, Charter and Bylaws, adopted April 15, 2025. "Good evening," Mariah began, her voice steady and warm. 6 months ago, our town was threatened by fear and silence. Today we stand together, united by the conviction that justice is not a privilege reserved for the few, but a right guaranteed to all. A wave of nods and murmurs of agreement washed through the room. Tonight marks the culmination of our journey. We present for ratification the Willow Creek Accountability Charter, which outlines the permanent structures to ensure that the tragedies of the past will never repeat themselves. She gestured to Jenna, who stood and distributed crisp, tri-fold copies of the charter, detailing civilian law enforcement liaisons, publicly accessible internal affairs reports, regular town hall oversight sessions, and an independent review board with subpoena power. Jenna's eyes met Mariah's for a brief, triumphant moment before turning back to address the room. Key provisions include mandatory body camera upload within 24 hours of any citizen encounter, quarterly public reports on use of force incidents, and the establishment of a civilian investigative panel with equal voting power in officer discipline decisions. She paused as a hush fell. These aren't just policies on paper. They're the blueprint for a safer, more accountable Willow Creek. From the back of the room, Ellie rolled forward, the front wheels clicking on the linoleum. She tapped the microphone base to adjust its height, then leaned in. "I never imagined I'd be here chairing a committee that once would have silenced me with a single power trip," she said, voice soft but ringing with authority. "But I told you all those months ago, evidence is power, and our quiet determination can topple the darkest corners of abuse." A ripple of laughter and applause followed. "Now I get to ask you, will you join us in making these reforms permanent? Will you pledge to uphold transparency, accountability, and respect in every interaction with our law enforcement partners?" Hands shot up around the room, some tentatively, others with emphatic fervor. One by one on Mariah's cue, volunteers rose to say "I do," filling the space with a chorus of communal commitment. Parents with children in their arms, veterans in camouflage jackets, elementary school teachers in pastel cardigans. Every affirmation echoed a shared promise to stand guard over Willow Creek's newfound integrity. As the final "I do" rang out, Mariah called the vote. It was unanimous, an extraordinary feat for any local meeting, let alone one that had sparked divisions so deep. The gavel, once dusty in the clerk's office, came down in Mariah's hand, the sound echoing like thunder. "Charter ratified," she declared, her smile bright. "Let this be the moment our town redefined itself." When the hall emptied, Jenna gathered up stray copies of the charter while Ellie and Mariah lingered at the lectern, greeting well-wishers and shaking hands. Outside the doors, the warm May night air was alive with the buzz of conversation. Neighbors congratulating one another, deputies quietly nodding in acknowledgement, and children darting around the porch lights, their laughter a promise of hope. Later, as lantern-lit tables on the grass were set with cookies and lemonade, Mariah and Ellie settled at a picnic bench beneath the old oak, where, 6 months earlier, they had vowed to shatter the town's complicity with silence. Jenna joined them, phone in hand. "News vans are gearing up for interviews," she reported, eyes sparkling. "National outlets want to know how Willow Creek did it." Ellie leaned back, gazing at the flickering candle on the table. "Let them ask," she said. "They'll get the same answer. We listened, we recorded, and we refused to be invisible." Mariah nodded, her gaze drifting to the distant hills painted by sunset. "This can be a model for small towns everywhere, proof that grassroots activism, built on dignity and documentation, can reach even the highest levels of power." She paused, reaching for Ellie's hand. "And we've shown that age, mobility, or title can't define who gets to demand accountability." As the evening grew quiet, Mayor Gonzalez approached, flanked by Sheriff Gonzalez, who last they'd heard was finishing his own report on preliminary disciplinary actions. The younger Gonzalez's expression was both humble and hopeful. "Judge Delgado, Miss Patterson, Jana," he began, voice earnest. "I want to thank you for leading us through this reckoning. The Town Council authorized funding to support the Oversight Committee, including a community legal fund, educational grants, and additional body cameras for traffic and public safety department vehicles. That's more than words. It's a tangible investment in trust." Ellie's eyes welled with tears. "Thank you, Mayor," she replied. "Thank you for stepping up." That night, as the first fireflies emerged above Willow Creek's streets, the sense of possibility felt limitless. Reports had come in, neighboring towns forming their own watch coalitions, state legislators drafting new oversight bills inspired by Willow Creek's charter, and civil rights groups clamoring to share the model nationwide. Back at her desk the next morning, Mariah reviewed an email from the U.S. Department of Justice offering a federal workshop on implementing community review boards. Jenna tapped out a reply inviting DOJ representatives to speak at the next town hall. Ellie studied the coffee in one hand, her morning paper in the other, smiled at the letter from Laya, the scholarship recipient who'd written about following Martha's example. Laya's handwritten note brimmed with gratitude. "Your strength taught me to stand and speak when injustice whispers." Mariah gazed out her office window at the budding dogwoods lining Main Street, now festooned with small Watch Willow Creek banners made by local volunteers. "This is just the beginning," she whispered, more a vow than an observation. Ellie rose, wheeling herself to the window beside Mariah. "We've dismantled the walls," she said, voice full of warmth, "but now we build new bridges, on every street, in every precinct, between every neighbor and every officer." As the sun climbed higher, casting gentle light on a town reborn, the sense of purpose in Willow Creek was undeniable. A community had reclaimed its soul, not with loud protest, but with clear eyes, steady cameras, and unwavering courage. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly bring fresh challenges, one truth remained. The strongest roots of justice grow when ordinary people stand firm, together, refusing to shrink in the face of fear. And so Willow Creek stood, steadfast as spring's first blossoms, a testament to what can happen when truth meets determination and refuses to let go. It all came down to a quiet Wednesday evening when Deputy Harris realized she'd picked the wrong woman to intimidate. Evelyn Turner's slow, measured response to his demands, first for ID, then for an apology, didn't happen by accident. It was years of courtroom battles, late-night research, and unwavering resolve that made her refusal not just an act of self-defense, but a catalyst for an entire town to confront its own blind spot. When she calmly reminded him that she had every right to walk her own neighborhood, she didn't just reclaim her dignity, she held up a mirror to every uniform, every assumption, every quiet tolerance that had let abuses stack up behind polite smiles and historical facades. By the time the footage went viral, the ripple had already turned into a wave. Neighbors who once tucked their eyes away at the sound of sirens now lined up at town meetings, sharing stories they'd carried for decades. Stories of harassing traffic stops, of offhand slurs, of friends and family shuffled through handcuffs simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. A rookie officer's decision to speak out, the sheriff's reluctant reopening of internal investigations, and the state attorney general's special task force, their combined courage proved that change doesn't require grand gestures or perfect timing. It demands persistence, evidence, and the willingness of everyday people to refuse the default setting of silence. Here's what Willow Creek teaches us all. Use your phone to record what happens in front of your eyes. Your video may be the spark that turns a whisper into a movement. Gather your neighbors for living room strategy sessions as often as you post on social media, because face-to-face conversations build the trust behind every successful push for reform. Find allies inside the system, whether it's a junior detective with a conscience or a state investigator hungry for the truth, and work together toward a shared goal. Never underestimate the power of calm, consistent pressure, filing formal complaints, demanding public oversight, refusing to let an apology or a boilerplate statement substitute for real accountability. And remember that fixing one bad actor is only the beginning. You have to insist and vote to change the rules and make sure the next generation never faces the same blind spots. If you felt the weight of this story, if you believe someone needs to see that dignity isn't a privilege but a right, drop a comment with one. If you want me to dig deeper, refine the narrative, or bring you another chapter of truth and reckoning, type 0. Your feedback shapes every episode we create together.